Hello, my name is Tolg, and I exist, therefore I think too much. I'm gonna read Kafka the Metamorphosis today. I guess I should give a warning. I am hungover, so I'm not necessarily. This is the second time I shot this, and I'm not necessarily reading the sentences perfectly well. Hence the second time. Also, I think that's just a straight read through. I don't know that I'm going to comment, but we'll see. And if I do, I cuss when I talk. So there's a warning. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. He was lying on his hard, as it were armor-plated, back, and when he lifted his head a little, he could see his dome-like brown belly divided into stiff, arched segments, on top of which the bedquilt could hardly keep in position, and was about to slide off completely. His numerous legs, which were pitifully thin compared to the rest of his bulk, waved helplessly before his eyes. "What has happened to me?" he thought. It was no dream. His room, a regular human bedroom, only rather too small, lay quiet between the four familiar walls. Above the table on which a collection of cloth samples was unpacked and spread out, Samsa was a commercial traveler, hung the picture, which he had recently cut out of an illustrated magazine and put into a pretty gilt frame. It showed a lady, with a fur cap on and a fur stole, sitting upright and holding out to the spectator a huge fur muff, into which the whole of her forearm had vanished. Gregor's eyes turned next to the window, and the overcast sky, one could hear raindrops beating on the window gutter, made him quite melancholy. What about sleeping a little longer and forgetting all this nonsense, he thought. But it could not be done, for he was accustomed to sleep on his right side, and in his present condition he could not turn himself over. However violently he forced himself toward his right side, he always rolled onto his back again. He tried it at least 100 times, shutting his eyes to keep from seeing his struggling legs, and only desisted when he began to feel in his side a faint, dull ache he had never experienced before. "Oh God," he thought, "what an exhausting job I've picked on. Traveling about day in, day out. It's much more irritating work than doing the actual business in the office. And on top of that, there's the trouble of constant traveling, of worrying about train connections, the bed and irregular meals, casual acquaintances that are always new and never become intimate friends. The devil take it all." He felt a slight itching up on his belly, slowly pushed himself on his back near to the top of the bed so that he could lift his head more easily, identified the itching place, which was surrounded by many small white spots, the nature of which he could not understand, and made to touch it with a leg, but drew the leg back immediately, for the contact made a cold shiver run through him. He slid down again into his former position. This getting up early, he thought, makes one quite stupid. A man needs his sleep. Other commercials live like harem woman. For instance, when I come back to the hotel of a morning to write up the orders I've got, these others are only sitting down to the breakfast. Let me just try that with my chief. I'd be sacked on the spot. Anyhow, that might be quite a good thing for me. Who can tell? If I didn't have to hold my hand because of my parents, I'd have given notice long ago. I'd have gone to the chief and told him exactly what I think of him. That would knock him endways from his desk. It's a queer way of doing, too, this sitting on high at a desk and talking down to employees, especially when they have to come quite near because the chief is hard of hearing. Well, there's still hope. Once I've saved enough money to pay back my parents' debts to him, that should take another 5 or 6 years, I'll do it without fail. I'll cut myself completely loose then. For the moment, though, I'd better get up, since my train goes at 5. He looked at the alarm clock ticking on the chest. Heavenly Father, he thought. It was 6:30, and the hands were quietly moving on. It was even past the half hour. It was getting on toward 7:15. Had the alarm clock not gone off? From the bed one could see that it had been properly set for 4 o'clock. Of course it must have gone off. Yes, but was it possible to sleep quietly through that ear-splitting noise? Well, he had not slept quietly, yet apparently all the more soundly for that. But what was he to do now? The next train went at 7 o'clock. To catch that, he would need to hurry like mad, and his samples weren't even packed up. And he himself wasn't feeling particularly fresh and active. And even if he did catch the train, he wouldn't avoid a row with the chief, since the firm's porter would have been waiting for the 5 o'clock train and would have long since reported his failure to turn up. The porter was a creature of the chief's, spineless and stupid. Well, supposing he were to say he was sick, but that would be most unpleasant and would look suspicious, since during his 5 years' employment he had not been ill once. The chief himself would be sure to come with the sick insurance doctor, would reproach his parents with their son's laziness, and would cut all excuses short by referring to the insurance doctor, who of course regarded all mankind as perfectly healthy malingerers. And would he be so far wrong on this occasion? Gregor really felt quite well, apart from a drowsiness that was utterly superfluous after such a long sleep, and he was even unusually hungry. As all this was running through his mind at top speed without his being able to decide to leave his bed, the alarm clock had just struck 7:15. There came a cautious tap at the door behind the head of his bed. "Gregor?" said a voice. It was his mother's. "It's 7:15. Hadn't you a train to catch?" That gentle voice. Gregor had a shock as he heard his own voice answering hers, unmistakably his own voice. It was true, but with a persistent, horrible twittering squeak behind it like an undertone, which left the words in their clear shape only for the first moment, and then rose up reverberating around them to destroy their sense, so that one could not be sure one had heard them rightly. Gregor wanted to answer at length and explain everything, but in the circumstances he confined himself to saying, Yes, thank you, Mother. I'm getting up now." The wooden door between them must have kept the change in his voice from being noticeable outside, for his mother contented herself with this statement and shuffled away. Yet this brief exchange of words had made the other members of the family aware that Gregor was still in the house, as they had not expected, and at one of the side doors his father was already knocking gently, yet with a fist. "Gregor, Gregor," he called. "What's the matter with you?" And after a little while he called again in a deeper voice, "Gregor, Gregor." At the other side door his sister was saying in a low, plaintive tone, "Gregor, aren't you well? Are you needing anything?" He answered them both at once. "I'm just ready," and it is best to make his voice sound as normal as possible by enunciating the words very clearly and leaving long pauses between them. So his father went back to his breakfast, but his sister whispered, "Gregor, open the door. Do." However, he was not thinking of opening the door and felt thankful for the prudent habit he had acquired in traveling of locking all doors during the night, even at home. His immediate intention was to get up quietly without being disturbed, to put on his clothes and above all eat his breakfast, and only then consider what else was to be done, since in bed, he was well aware, his meditations would come to no sensible conclusion. He remembered that often enough in bed he had felt small aches and pains, probably caused by awkward postures, which had proved purely imaginary once he got up, and he looked forward eagerly to seeing this morning's delusions gradually fall away. That the change in his voice was nothing but the precursor of a severe chill, a standing ailment of commercial travelers, he had not the least possible doubt. To get rid of the quilt was quite easy. He had only to inflate himself a little and it fell off by itself. But the next move was difficult, especially because he was so uncommonly broad. He would have needed arms and hands to hoist himself up. Instead, he had only the numerous little legs which never stopped waving in all directions, and which he could not control in the least. When he tried to bend one of them, it was the first to stretch itself straight, and did he succeed at last in making it do what he wanted, all the other legs meanwhile waved the more wildly in a high degree of unpleasant agitation. "But what's the use of lying idle in bed?" said Gregor to himself. He thought that he might get out of bed with the lower part of his body, but this lower part, which he had not yet seen, and of which he could form no clear conception, proved too difficult to move. It shifted so slowly, and when finally almost wild with annoyance, he gathered his forces together and thrust out recklessly. He had miscalculated the direction and bumped heavily against the lower end of the bed, and the stinging pain he felt informed him that precisely this lower part of his body was at the moment probably the most sensitive. So he tried to get the top part of himself out first, and cautiously moved his head toward the edge of the bed. That proved easy enough, and despite its breadth and mass, the bulk of his body at last slowly followed the movement of his head. Still, when he finally got his head free over the edge of the bed, he felt too scared to go on advancing, for after all, if he let himself fall in this way, it would take a miracle to keep his head from being injured. And at all costs, he must not lose consciousness now, precisely now. He would rather stay in bed. But when after a repetition of the same efforts, he lay in his former position again, sighing, and watched his little legs struggling against each other more wildly than ever, if that were possible, and saw no way of bringing any order into this arbitrary confusion, he told himself again that it was impossible to stay in bed, and that the most sensible course was to risk everything for the smallest hope of getting away with it. At the same time, he did not forget to remind himself occasionally that cool reflection, the coolest possible, was much better than desperate resolves. In such moments he focused his eyes as sharply as possible on the window, but, unfortunately, the prospect of the morning fog, which muffled even the other side of the narrow street, brought him little encouragement and comfort. 7 o'clock already, he said to himself when the alarm clock chimed again. 7 o'clock already, and still such thick fog. And for a little while he lay quiet, breathing lightly, as if perhaps expecting such complete repose to restore all things to their real and normal condition. But then he said to himself, "Before it strikes 7:15, I must be quite out of this bed without fail. Anyhow, by that time, someone will have come from the office to ask for me, since it opens before 7. And he set himself to rocking his whole body at once in a regular rhythm, with the idea of swinging it out of the bed. If he tipped himself out in that way, he could keep his head from injury by lifting it at an acute angle when he fell. His back seemed to be hard, and was not likely to suffer from a fall on the carpet. His biggest worry was the loud crash he would not be able to help making, which would probably cause anxiety, if not terror, behind all the doors. Still, he must take the risk. When he was already half out of the bed, the new method was more a game than an effort, for he needed only to hitch himself across by rocking to and fro. It struck him how simple it would be if he could get help. 2 strong people, he thought of his father and the servant girl, would be amply sufficient. They would only have to thrust their arms under his convex back, lever him out of the bed, bend down with their burden, and then be patient enough to let him turn himself right over onto the floor, where it was to be hoped his legs would then find their proper function. Well, ignoring the fact that the doors were all locked, ought he really to call for help? In spite of his misery, he could not suppress a smile at the very idea of it. He had got so far that he could barely keep his equilibrium when he rocked himself strongly, and he would have to nerve himself very soon for the final decision, since in 5 minutes' time it would be 7:15 when the front door bell rang. That's someone from the office, he said to himself, and grew almost rigid, while his little legs only jigged about all the faster. For a moment everything stayed quiet. "They're not going to open the door?" said Gregor to himself, catching at some kind of irrational hope. But then, of course, the servant girl went as usual to the door with her heavy tread and opened it. Gregor needed only to hear the first good morning of the visitor to know immediately who it was, the chief clerk himself. What a fate, to be condemned to work for a firm where the smallest omission at once gave rise to the gravest suspicion. Were all employees in a body nothing but scoundrels? Was there not among them one single loyal, devoted man who, had he wasted only an hour or so of the firm's time in a morning, was so tormented by conscience as to be driven out of his mind and actually incapable of leaving his bed? Wouldn't it really have been sufficient to send an apprentice to inquire, if any inquiry were necessary at all? Did the chief clerk himself have to come and thus indicate to the entire family, an innocent family, that this suspicious circumstance could be investigated by no one less versed in affairs than himself? And more through the agitation caused by these reflections than through any act of will, Gregor swung himself out of bed with all his strength. There was a loud thump, but it was not really a crash. His fall was broken to some extent by the carpet. His back, too, was less stiff than he thought, and so there was merely a dull thud, not so very startling, only he had not lifted his head carefully enough and had hit it. He turned it and rubbed it on the carpet in pain and irritation. "That was something falling down in there," said the chief clerk in the next room to the left. Gregor tried to suppose to himself that something like what had happened to him today might someday happen to the chief clerk. One really could not deny that it was possible. But as if in brusque reply to this supposition, the chief clerk took a couple of firm steps in the next door room, and his patent leather boots creaked. From the right-hand room his sister was whispering to inform him of the situation. "Gregor, the chief clerk's here." "I know," muttered Gregor to himself, but he didn't dare to make his voice loud enough for his sister to hear it. "Gregor," said his father, now from the left-hand room, "the chief clerk has come and wants to know why you didn't catch the early train. We don't know what to say to him. Besides, he wants to talk to you in person. So open the door, please. He will be good enough to excuse the untidiness of your room." "Good morning, Mr. Samsa," the chief clerk was calling amiably meanwhile. "He's not well," said his mother to the visitor, while his father was still speaking through the door. "He's not well, sir, believe me. What else would make him miss a train? The boy thinks about nothing but his work. It makes me almost cross, the way he never goes out in the evenings. He's been here the last 8 days, and has stayed at home every single evening. He just sits there, quietly, at the table, reading a newspaper or looking through railway timetables. The only amusement he gets is doing fretwork. For instance, he spent 2 or 3 evenings cutting out a little picture frame. You would be surprised to see how pretty it is. It's hanging in his room. You'll see it in a minute when Gregor opens the door. I must say I'm glad you've come, sir. We should never have got him to unlock the door by ourselves. He's so obstinate. And I'm sure he's unwell, though he wouldn't have it to be so this morning." "I'm just coming," said Gregor slowly and carefully, not moving an inch for fear of losing one word of the conversation. "I can't think of any other explanation, madam," said the chief clerk. "I hope it's nothing serious, although on the other hand I must say that we men of business, fortunately or unfortunately, very often simply have to ignore any slight indisposition, since business must be attended to." "Well, can the chief clerk come in now?" asked Gregor's father impatiently, again knocking on the door. "No," said Gregor. In the left-hand room, a painful silence followed this refusal. In the right-hand room, his sister began to sob. "Oh, man, I'm in pain." Why didn't his sister join the others? She was probably newly out of bed and hadn't even begun to put on her clothes yet. Well, why was she crying? Because he wouldn't get up and let the chief clerk in, because he was in danger of losing his job, and because the chief would begin dunning his parents again for the old debts? Surely these were things one didn't need to worry about for the present. Gregor was still at home, and not in the least thinking of deserting the family. At the moment, true, he was lying on the carpet, and no one who knew the condition he was in could seriously expect him to admit the chief clerk. But for such a small discourtesy, which could plausibly be explained away somehow later on, Gregor could hardly be dismissed on the spot. And it seemed to Gregor that it would be much more sensible to leave him in peace for the present than to trouble him with tears and entreaties. Still, of course, their uncertainty bewildered them all, and excused their behavior. "Mr. Samsa," the chief clerk called now in a louder voice, "what's the matter with you? Here you are, barricading yourself in your room, giving only yes and no for answers, causing your parents a lot of unnecessary trouble, and neglecting, I mention this only in passing, neglecting your business duties in an incredible fashion. I am speaking here in the name of your parents and of your chief, and I beg you quite seriously to give me an immediate and precise explanation. You amaze me. You amaze me. I thought you were a quiet, dependable person, and now all at once you seem bent on making a disgraceful exhibition of yourself. The chief did hint to me early this morning a possible explanation for your disappearance, with reference to the cash payments that were entrusted to you recently, but I almost pledged my solemn word of honor that this could not be so. But now that I see how incredibly obstinate you are, I no longer have the slightest desire to take your part at all, and your position in the firm is not so unassailable. I came with the intention of telling you all this in private, but since you are wasting my time so needlessly, I don't see why your parents shouldn't hear it too. For some time past, your work has been most unsatisfactory. This is not the season of the year for a business boom. Of course, we admit that, but a season of the year for doing no business at all. That does not exist, Mr. Samsa. Must not exist. "But sir," cried Gregor, beside himself and in his agitation forgetting everything else, "I'm just going to open the door this very minute. A slight illness, an attack of giddiness, has kept me from getting up. I'm still lying in bed, but I feel all right again. I'm getting out of bed now. Just give me a moment or two longer. I'm not quite so well as I thought, but I'm all right, really. How a thing like that can suddenly strike one down. Only last night I was quite well, my parents can tell you, or rather, I did have a slight presentiment. I must have showed some sign of it. Why didn't I report it at the office? But one always thinks that an indisposition can be got over without staying in the house. Oh, sir, do spare my parents. All that you're reproaching me with now has no foundation. No one has ever said a word to me about it. Perhaps you haven't looked at the last orders I sent in. Anyhow, I can still catch the 8 o'clock train. I'm much the better for my few hours' rest. Don't let me detain you here, sir. I'll be attending to business very soon, and do be good enough to tell the chief so, and to make my excuses to him." Okay, it's 23 minutes, and like I said, very hungover. Thoughts so far are hard to put together because it hasn't really said a whole lot in its story, other than what's that one manga title? Something I've reincarnated as a slime. This just sounds like generally any isekai manga out there right now, except I guess it would have been incarnated into his life, just in a different body. Though there are a hell of a lot of good quotes. I like I'm really bad at quoting. Immediately my brain just translates them to something that makes sense to me and then forgets the words but gets the idea across. Don't wake up early, it makes a man stupid. Something along those lines. That one's pretty good. Although that is a very old-fashioned thought. Though I like it all the same. Yeah. It was related to me that Kafka was a lot like Escher. I kind of admittedly expected a little bit more from even just the beginning, given how much the two commenters pushed for me reading this. And it is a shorter story, so I'm surprised it really hasn't gotten much farther than being stuck in bed. Though I guess the other part that of his writing is that psychologically, the legs did not follow what the head wanted, which is really surprising. I assume it's, characterizing a grasshopper or a cockroach, but that the legs do not respond to what the head wants is... Alrighty, so that was the Metamorphosis, just a few pages of it, and I will continue reading randomly throughout my life until it is done, and I have a solid opinion about it. Good night. May your wants align with your needs. Eat well, drink well, sleep well, and be well, and presumably, hopefully, you can manage to do well. Alrighty, bye.